One shooting, one man put behind prison, but with 13 alibis saying he was not even in the same state as the murder.
Will our intrepid Dateline NBC reporter finally uncover the truth and get the man out of prison?
Let's find out on the full recap of 13 Alibis on this episode of So Much Crime,
So Little Time. Before we get to the show, just a reminder to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/SoMuchCrime, So Little Time. If you go there, you will see a bunch of extended clips, bonus clips. We have early release episodes. If you want to get recaps like this right away, you don't want to wait for Friday to roll around. They're out early on Patreon.
Dun, dun, dun. Waddle, waddle. Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Dee.
And I'm Jeff. And before we start, just a warning that this episode will have spoilers for 13 Alibis. We're going to discuss the whole series.
If you haven't listened yet, check out our preview episode on this show. It's the one before this one in your feed.
You'll also find a link for 13 Alibis in our show notes.
Okay, before we jump in, let's go through what is 13 Alibis about.
Yeah, so 13 Alibis came out in 2019. It was put out by Dateline NBC. It's hosted by Dan Slepian. He's a producer and reporter for Dateline. There are 8 total episodes. Really, there's 7 total episodes. We said 8 last time. Turns out there's actually 7 plus a bonus episode.
But 7 plus 1 makes 8.
7 plus 1 is, I think that's 8. Anyway, each one is only about 10 to 20 minutes long.
In our preview episode, we discussed episode 1. We learned about Richard Rosario, who was convicted of murdering Jorge Collazo in 1996 in the Bronx. Rosario was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. But Rosario had 13 witnesses saying he was in Florida, not New York, at the time of the murder. Jeff, let's discuss. Interestingly, in the bonus episode, episode 8 in the feed, Dan Slepian said that he could summarize this story in 2 or 3 sentences. A lot of the time, he said, when we have complex cases of people who are behind bars and claiming to be innocent, it's tangly, it's complex, it's kind of clear how maybe the confusion happened. But here, he said it wasn't. He could explain it in a few sentences. The murder happened in New York. Richard Rosario claimed he was in Florida, had 13 witnesses to back him up, gave that information to the police, and the police never investigated it.
Yeah, that's the story. There's other things that we had asked about or wondered about in the preview episode that I feel like we find out about everything that I was curious about. One thing we talked about was what happened with his lawyers. Why were his lawyers seemingly so bad? Turns out they were court-appointed lawyers. He didn't have money for his own private lawyers. And if you can't pay for lawyers, you get bad legal representation. So the lawyers got funding to go to Florida or to talk to the people in Florida, the witnesses, and then
just didn't go.
They just didn't do it, which, I mean, I want to jump right into something that this reminded me of. So this definitely reminded me of Blind Plea. And where we were talking about Devin Gray, who murdered her boyfriend, but it was really in self-defense. But still, she was convicted of murder and sent to prison for a long time before finally getting out. I mean, it's another case of someone who didn't belong in prison. But you just saw 2 things that really stood out to me. One is how if you don't have money, you get screwed over by the system, which is maybe obvious to say. But then the second thing is just how slow the system moves. He just sat in prison for years and years waiting for his first trial, waiting for his appeals. His appeals went all the way to the Supreme Court, kept trying to get a retrial, but it's 20 years that he was in prison, which is an absurd amount of time for a guy who didn't do it, right? Didn't do anything wrong, had a perfect alibi.
And to be fair, like the difference here between here and Devin Gray. So in Devin Gray's case, someone was, I'm using air quotations, someone was a witness. So apparently on the phone to Devin when the shooting happened.
Right.
And said that it was Devin that did it. And she was the aggressor in the relationship. Here, you do have 2 witnesses who pick seemingly Richard Rosario out from a whole book full of photographs. But I say seemingly, we can come back to that. But he has 13 witnesses to say he wasn't even there. For Devin Gray, we both adored Blind Plea. We both were really on Devon's side there. But for Devon Gray, she didn't have the strength of that. She had a few people who had noticed the abuse that she was suffering, but we didn't have the solid evidence of 13 people. Like, some of the people didn't even like Richard Rosario. Like, why would they say that he was there when he wasn't? Like, some solid evidence. Like, Jeff, do you know what was mad?
What was mad?
It reminded me a bit of the Adnan Syed case that was covered in Serial season 1, where we have people who have such crisp memories from, 20 years ago. And I remember hearing in Serial, one of the ways people have such clear memories is when something significant in that day happens. So in Adnan Syed's case, it was used against him, saying, like, he doesn't really know where he was, but this is the day his girlfriend went missing, or his ex-girlfriend went missing. Surely this should make, like, lodge details of the day in his brain, because it's such a significant day in his life. Here, we have people who are saying, I remember at midday 20 years ago, I was standing right over there and I saw him. And Dan Slepian is like, how do you know that? And we have one person saying, well, I went into labor and I ended up having my son the next day. And another person saying, well, he's the guy who told me my grandchild was born and he was standing right there. So we have people who have clear-cut, solid reasoning as to why they know he was there, but they were just never asked. And when they were asked and their testimony was brought to court, it didn't work. That's what confused me when they did eventually get asked.
Yeah, when we went into this, that was the thing. That was the thing that I was most curious about, is how do these people... Okay, so Dan Slepian is going to go 20 years later to Florida and talk to these people. Mm-hmm. How are they possibly going to have reliable memories? But that's the first thing you learn. It's like, oh yeah, because he was staying with this couple that had their baby, and they have their now 20-year-old son, who his birthday is the day after the murder. So of course they know where they were. Yeah, and they know who was staying at their house. And like you alluded to, the woman didn't want Richard Rosario there because she didn't like him, thought he was trouble. Mm-hmm. She has no reason to defend him. So you're talking about what happened with Devon Gray in Blind Plea. And one of the things, I don't remember if we talked about this in the episode, our episode on it, but one of the things I remember from one of the interviews that happened with her from the police, or from a lawyer, I think it was a lawyer during her trial, where he asked her how she remembers such specific details from that night, from so long ago. And then he asked like a parallel question of, do you remember like what you had for dinner like a year ago on this random Thursday, or something like that? She's like, well, no, of course not.
The same.
Right, because it's totally not the same, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's a day where nothing significant happened, so why would you remember? I was going to actually ask you that. Do you remember random details about the day your children were born, or the day you went into labor?
Of course I do.
But do you remember like a month before that or a month after that, if I asked you about some specific date?
I mean, obviously not. And like, that's the thing that's kind of frustrating with people. I don't know. People are annoying.
That's your takeaway from this.
Well, I have so many more takeaways from this whole podcast. But yeah, people are annoying. Like, trying to compare apples to feckin' onions, not even oranges, like onions. It's not the same thing.
Well, okay. And the other side of this coin is the two witnesses who were basically responsible for Richard Rosario being put away. So one was Michael Sanchez, who was the friend of the victim. And the other one was this random dude who happened to be 10 feet away. But when Dan Slepian goes and talks to this guy, the whole thing falls apart. Like, he changes his whole story. He went from, I picked this guy's face out of this mugshot book with all these pictures, to basically the police said, this is the guy. Here's a couple of pictures. This is the guy.
So I'd wonder, like, I'd love to see the transcripts of the initial trial to see what he was actually asked in court. Is it a case that the police are saying, look, he picked him out, and Richard Rosario's defense didn't ask the right questions to show the holes in that witness's alibi? Because there's no doubt that I don't think he was in it trying to get someone innocent behind bars, because as soon as he heard some of the information back, he seemed to be disgusted in himself.
Yeah.
So that was obviously not questioned enough. Then the other aspect of this is Michael Sanchez. He wasn't like really questioned at all, it appears, or at least he wasn't challenged at all. I'm no detective and I'm no lawyer, but I have watched a hell of a lot of CSI. And the first thing you do is you talk to the person they're with. You challenge them. You make sure that it makes sense. That it aligns. Is there anyone who might be out to kill him? Nobody even asked that question. There was a gun on him, but we didn't hear that. Is that just because it was the 90s in New York? These were all really short episodes, so maybe it's just a case that we just didn't get all that detail. But to me, it's confusing. What did his defense do?
Well,
and also, what did the police do just to make sure? In the preview, I was like, look, it's not that shocking. There was a crime wave. You got someone, 2 witnesses, lock them up. And maybe that was the case in this precinct. By the sound of it, there was a pattern going on. But simple questions. It doesn't seem like, don't fly to Florida to check out this guy. Maybe call them. Maybe question the witnesses a little bit more.
Yeah.
It's real lazy.
Lazy or intentional, right? Because the other thing that we didn't talk about is one of the groups that went to Richard Rosario's defense is the Exoneration Initiative. And one of the first things we hear about them is they found that there was a third witness, Nicole Torres, who was never brought up in the original case. Whatever happened there, maybe it was laziness or maybe it was something else, right? Maybe there was some sort of deliberate, I presume it was just to close the books on this case, right? Let's find a guy we can pin it on and suppress anything that refutes the evidence that we like.
So is this just for numbers and stats then? Because I don't really get this. Because surely, and maybe, look, this is definitely, not maybe, this is definitely a naive outlook on things. You want to just get someone? You don't care who it is. Is that just so that the police force look better? Is that what we're getting at here? Is that, or allegedly, do you think allegedly that that was the focus of it? Because I don't understand. Surely you're trying to get a person who is capable of murder off the street so that more people aren't murdered.
Right. I understand that if you're in a crime-filled city, and I've watched enough of The Wire to have empathy for the job of the police in a city filled with crime and hard to solve crimes and unreliable witnesses and all of these challenges. But yeah, we're
so educated on crime with CSI and The Wire, aren't we?
I've also watched a fair amount of Law and Order, as we've talked about before. So 2 things, and this is alluded to in the podcast, both you're locking up a guy who didn't do it. And maybe he was a criminal as a teenager. Maybe he did some bad things. Maybe he wasn't a nice guy. That's irrelevant. He didn't do this, first of all. And second of all, the guy who did it, still out there.
Mm-hmm.
He's still out there, maybe committing more crimes. And the family doesn't get really the justice they deserve. I don't know. It's frustrating. I think what I appreciated about the way this podcast covered this story was we got to hear from so many people.
So how do they fit it all in?
It's remarkable. The amount of time it took to listen to this is so short. It's really, the story is told over 7 episodes. It's, I'd say, under 2 hours of content. And we hear from a bunch of the witnesses. We hear from the sister of the victim. We hear from one of the detectives.
Kids of Richard Rosario.
Oh, we should talk about the kids. Yeah, so we had, 2 kids who were very, very small when he went to prison.
They seem delightful. Singing a song when they're anxious together before going to see their dad? Stop it. Broke my heart a little bit.
Yeah, that was hard to listen to.
It was. And it was also hard to listen to when he got out. And it's not as if you get out and your relationships are totally fine and you're not traumatized and you're able to function in society. You're just lashed out there.
Yeah, he was barely an adult when he went to prison. And then he spends 20 years, basically his 20s and 30s, in prison.
We do need to take a moment. I need to take a moment to talk about his wife, Minerva. I need to talk to her.
You want to have a pint with her?
I want to have a pint with her.
Why?
I don't think she's a pint woman. I reckon we might have a glass of wine together.
Okay.
I'll reach out and ask her.
You want to have a glass of wine? Why did she stand out to you?
She stood by him. She had 2 young children. She stands by him. She brings them to see their dad. She raises the kids. And then she's open arms when he comes back. And not only that, when he's struggling, and as he said, Richard Rosario says himself, she's raised the 2 kids on her own. And then I come back and I'm living in her house.
Yeah.
She's paying for me to live in her house. And she is still there. I'm like, he's struggling. And obviously she's standing by him. But that, we can't gloss over that.
No, it's remarkable.
Relationships are hard when you're together, let alone when you're apart for that long. And then when they come back and they're struggling and you're like, here, like, guess what I've been doing for the last 20 odd years. It's just a lot. I just think she's some sort of saint.
No, I mean, I can sit here and pat myself on the back for having been in a long distance relationship for, a year? Neither one of us was in prison with a 25 to life sentence. And
neither one of you were raising young kids on your own.
No.
And trying to make ends meet.
Well, and also, it's not like he was seemingly a great guy when he went into prison. He had his problems. He had his troubles. He had a criminal record. He...
Like the booze.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it is. What she did, how she kind of stood by him and supported him was amazing. And I think also his growth, like his sort of emotional maturity that we heard when he gets out and like talking about the struggles that he had to adjust to life outside and to hold a job, right? Like he was having a real hard time holding on to a job. We heard about that with Devin Gray too, right? Just because you're out, like doesn't mean suddenly you jump right back into life. You maybe don't have a great support system. So in Richard Rosario's case, yeah, he had his wife and his kids who seemed amazing, right? Like his kids seem like amazing young people.
And then even like when he got out and he did get a job, he was like, when I found out that everyone on my team that I was working with in construction were ex-cons, I had to leave because I just felt like I was back again.
Yeah.
I'm going to pause and say if I was his wife, if that was my husband and he left the job, I'd have a real hard time being like, oh, you're just gonna arse around the house for a bit. And I know that's diminishing like the trauma he went through. And I can understand the relationship between being in prison and having to do all the different things you have to do in prison. I can't relate to that. But I get that connected too much and it was too close. But I also get that he's like, I don't want to be in a bucket. Like if I'm getting a job, I want to get out of this bucket that I was put in that was unnecessary. Like I shouldn't have been in there in the first place. Like I don't want to be seen as an ex-con. I want to be seen as a free man, like a man who was never incarcerated because I should never have been incarcerated. But yeah, I don't know. Tough slog.
Yeah.
Seriously.
So he sues the people who wronged him, right? And he ends up winning a $5 million settlement. His lawyers get a separate $4 million settlement.
What do they get it for?
Well, he finally found some good lawyers, apparently.
I mean, but like bad T's and C's.
Pat, what?
Terms and conditions.
Oh.
T's and C's.
The way that was written in the thing that I read about it, which T's and C's. In 2020, so this is after the podcast came out, he filed a claim for compensation in New York State Court of Claims. That got denied. But separately, he had a lawsuit in the Bronx County Supreme Court against the city of New York and several police officers where he wanted compensation for his wrongful conviction. That's where he won. In 2022, he won $5 million. And then in 2023, the court gave his attorneys $4 million in fees and expenses.
Oh, so did he claim the fees and expenses on top then?
I guess so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that makes me feel better.
But I mean, okay, we shouldn't focus on the lawyers. Let's talk. I guess we should focus a little on the lawyers. But I mean, he got $5 million. I wanted to ask you, like, do you think? I mean, his life was turned upside down. He was put in prison for 20 years. He missed his kids growing up. He is still dealing with like trying to recover from that. Does $5 million seem like that makes that all better?
Not where we live.
Sure.
But
in Florida, maybe
it's better than no $1 million.
Sure. I don't know the right number.
There isn't a right number. You cannot put a number on that.
No.
You absolutely cannot put a number on that. There's no way you can. I think at least he got something.
Yeah.
And it's life-changing. To get $5 million, that is life-changing. At least he got that. But I couldn't give a number that I think would be worth it.
Yeah, I don't know the right number.
I hope he bought Minerva something deadly.
I'm sure he did. I believe he did. So in the preview episode, we debated Dan Slepian as a host.
I think I need to make a public apology.
Why?
Because I was a bit harsh on Dan Slepian, and it seems like he might be some sort of saint too. In that follow-up episode, I was like, geez, this guy does a lot for people who like need to have their stories told.
In the 8th episode, the wrongful convictions episode.
He's having a chat. First of all, I loved it. I think I enjoyed that episode maybe more. I enjoyed Dan Slepian in that episode maybe more than I did throughout the podcast. But I do have to say, he doesn't make any of this series about himself. He really focuses on the people that are impacted the most. And I think that needs to be called out. He also isn't smarmy. I'm sorry, Dan. Forgive me, please.
Well, I think I said some similar things. And I think in the first episode, and I reflected on this because I think in episode 8, in that interview episode, he comes across very differently. But I think that's more just a natural who he really is, right? Like he came across as very humble, as very altruistic. I looked back on the 7 episodes that came before, and I think there was a little bit of like the Dateline effect of this, like it's a little bit slick. I think a little bit too is just like he's a guy from New York, and it's a little bit of just like regional affect. I don't think we can make judgments on his character based on that. I think some of that is just how.
Oh, but it was never on his character. It was that he was coming across weird. That's not about his character, though, is it? I suppose it is.
I think it is a little bit. My point is, in that interview in episode 8, the humility of how he came across and the good he is trying to do, even the way they introduced it, like they weren't trying to say all cops are bad. They really talked about how his experience on Dateline, a lot of good cops out there, a lot of good police work out there, but he has happened to focus on, in this particular focus of this podcast and some of the other stories he's worked on, including his new book, which is called The Sing Sing Files, which just came out in 2024, is about some of these cases of people who are wrongfully convicted and how he has made this a little bit of a project of his to help some of these people get out of prison, which is, I think, the most noble of pursuits, right? Like he repeats that stat in that interview that is in the beginning of this show about if just 2% of the people in prison are wrongfully convicted, that's tens and tens of thousands of people who didn't do it, who shouldn't be in prison, whose lives have been taken away from them. You know, maybe he's only helped a handful of people, but for each one of those people, it's been a life-changing difference. And bringing attention to their stories, right, is seemingly he's doing very good work there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like, shut up us. But also, I will say, I feel like maybe that episode 8, as you say, we're kind of seeing a bit more of him, and he is humble, and he seems real sound. I think you're right. I think it's maybe that Dateline effect of it's too scripted.
Yeah.
I even feel sometimes in our intros, if we script something, it's not as solid as when we're just chatting. And I feel like, not to compare us to someone who's on Dateline NBC, but I feel like often that is the case. This is one of Dateline's first podcasts. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's their first podcast. So they're honing in their skills. I will say, I loved how it kept it short and sweet, but what I've already alluded to the fact that in episode 8, Dan Slepian talks about how simple or easy it was to summarize this story because it was so clear cut.
Yeah.
It wasn't as tangly as other claims of being falsely imprisoned. I was kind of wondering, and sometimes I wonder whether I'm just looking for too much patterns within these things, but I was wondering, is that why the episodes were so short? Is it, let's not overcomplicate this with fluff. Let's keep this as clear cut as the summary is.
No, I don't think that's it. I think that's an editorial choice. I think someone, and I don't know if it was him or a producer on the show, was like, we're going to make a choice to make these episodes 15 minutes long. The same thing with the Home Babies, the last one we covered.
But why?
I mean, why is Joe Rogan's podcast 3 hours long? Someone decided that was the right length. That's what people wanted.
Let's not compare those things. But what I'm saying is, yeah, maybe that's what people wanted. But like, say if we look at Dateline's other podcasts that we've reviewed, the thing about Pam, that's not this short.
No, those are what, like half an hour long, 40 minutes long?
At least, yeah.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is there's a lot to say here. And there is more that I feel like that could have been put forward. I'm just saying, I wonder, was that aired? Like, obviously it was an editorial decision, or like it was a decision by the production team, but was it a decision because of how clear cut this case was.
Does the
That's
episode
not-
length match the
Yeah.
story's simplicity?
Exactly. Whereas with the thing about Pam, talk about tangly.
Sure.
It's wild. There
Yeah.
is a lot more complexity to it. There's a lot more layers. There's a lot more tangliness.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. That'd be an interesting thing to ask more hosts if we get a chance to talk to more hosts just about how they decide on the episode length, why they structure it like they do. Is that a conscious, like, is that driven by the demands of the story, or is it something else?
So your initial reaction was that you wanted to continue to listen to this. Was this a struggle for you to listen to?
No. And one of the things that I was thinking about as I was finishing listening to this and anticipating this conversation was when we first started doing our show and I told you, oh no, true crime, I have concerns about true crime. This is the kind of story that I will listen to all day. We've listened to a couple of stories that were similar. Blind Plea was maybe the most similar in terms of sort of a wrongful conviction and someone seeking justice, which is a subgenre of true crime that I find fascinating and important, and like people doing good work, trying to help people in need. And that's something that I will listen to 1,000 of these. And this was, I thought, really well made. I really enjoyed it. I appreciated so many facets of it. I think the thing that I most appreciated was how many people we heard from, right? It wasn't just Dan Slepian telling the story, although that would have been fine. It really was interview driven. And we've talked about this in the past. Ones that are interview driven, I think, are really strong. What about you?
Yeah, as I've said, Dan preferred him as things went on. But the story as a whole, I was devo. It was finished. I really wanted more. I was left wanting more. I've been looking up the case, reading up on it, to get more information on it already. And my only criticism, and it's not really a criticism, which is not a criticism of this podcast, is there a perfect balance between giving as much information as the listener might want versus giving the listener maybe too much information? Because I feel like we've gone back and forth.
We have, and we've listened now to 2 in a row, this and the Home Babies, which I think on both of those, I could have listened to it for much longer. Whereas ones in the past, and the one we often come back to is West Cork, where it could have been much, much shorter. Yeah, there's somewhere in between that's probably the right space. We should send our notes in to Dateline.
I think so. I think they'd appreciate it.
All right, I'll draft a sternly worded letter.
While Jeff is drafting a sternly worded letter to Dateline, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our Patreon, patreon.com/so much crime, so little time. If you join, you get early access to future shows, bonus content, lots of outtakes of me not being able to say the word content, even though I work in content, and you'll help also to support us making this show. Win-win for everyone.
All right, Dee, what are we going to talk about next time?
I think we should go back somewhere that we've been before. It is, in fact, Australia. We're going to Melbourne.
Okay.
We are going to a podcast called Phoebe's Fall. Have you heard about it?
I have not.
It's a podcast by the Age Newsroom in Melbourne, Australia, and it's into the death of Phoebe Handsjuk, who was found at the bottom of a garbage chute in a luxury apartment building.
So Phoebe's Fall, that's next time on So Much Crime.
So Little Time. So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of MindGov Media. The executive producer is Paxton Caloriso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show in your podcast app. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.